think the perspective that I bring is mostly that of techno-realism. It's trying to think about technologies rather than technology with a capital T. And often we tend to overestimate it. Very often we tend to ascribe the impact that other causes and other factors are actually having to technologies. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why I think we need to stay alert, and techno-realism is one of the ways to have at least some critical attitude towards technology. There is an inherent assumption in much of our internet debates that more information is always better, and collecting more information is always better, and that's a belief that does go back ultimately to the Enlightenment. And that's why I think a lot of companies that are in Silicon Valley, companies like Google, companies like Facebook, essentially get away with doing things that we wouldn't let other companies do, in essence part because they are in the information business. And because information business does have that Enlightenment origin, we tend to think that it's very different from oil trading, or it's very different from widget manufacturing. That's why we tend to be somewhat less critical of the ideologies that run through Silicon Valley. All solutions come with costs, right? And we need to know what those costs are. Very often, some of the apps and some of the solutions promoted by Silicon Valley, they would just offload all responsibility for problem solving on the shoulders of the consumer, with the consumer having to adjust their own behavior, whether it comes to food consumption, whether it comes to exercise, whether it comes to cutting down their emissions, without engaging in any sort of deeper structural, more meaningful reform, where we would also be changing laws and regulating the industry and building infrastructure. All those projects need to happen as well. And my concern is that if we get too excited about problem solving and we empower Silicon Valley to do the job, we might also abandon some of those more ambitious efforts that don't just force the consumer to optimize their behavior within the system, but to reform the system itself. We always think that openness is the good thing, and we tend to think that it means one thing across different contexts. And often you discover that it doesn't mean the same thing across different contexts, and very often it means different things even in one context, such as education. So one of the examples I give is the difference between the openness embedded in this massive online open courses known as MOOCs and the openness embedded in open educational resources, a somewhat older movement towards promoting openness in education. They rely on two different kinds of openness. The openness of MOOCs presumes that courses are available online for everyone, but the openness of open educational resources presumes that not only are courses available for everyone, but you can actually go and do something with them, remix, experiment, add your own lecture notes, and then release them on your own terms, right? So it would be incorrect to describe both of them as open. So my concern here is that we often engage in something that critics call open washing, right? It's akin to greenwashing, where we invoke something as green in order to strengthen its sort of ethical brand. And we do the same thing with open. We often proclaim that something is open, while in fact it isn't open, or it's not open enough. Now sharing is everywhere. We talk about the sharing economy and initiatives that are very different and startups that are very different. Uber and Airbnb and many others are all lumped together under this label of sharing economy, even though there is very little sharing happening there. It's people charging money for renting out their apartments and for renting out their cars. And where's the sharing part, right? Who's sharing what? I mean, yes, it's people sharing cabs, but there's not the kind of sharing that is often implied by advocates of free culture, where sharing is a gift. It's an act of benevolence. There is no gift underpinning Airbnb or Uber. Apps like Google Now trouble me not so much for the frictionlessness existence that they promote. And just to sort of give some background, Google Now monitors your activity across various Google services, so it knows that you need to catch a flight, and it will tell you that it's gonna rain at your destination, take an umbrella, leave early because there is traffic. It will check you into your flight, but it will also monitor how much walking you do on a monthly basis, for example, and will tell you that, well, perhaps you need to exercise more. or you need to walk more, and you're not walking enough, or you're walking less this month than the previous months. And it's a very good example of what some policymakers would call a nudge, right? So Google is actually nudging you to exercise more. And nudging has been subject to very fierce debate in many circles, and policy circles especially. And to me, the main concern with Google now is that, again, it empowers Google to embark on the kinds of reforms that should be up for deliberation, that should be up for discussion, that should be arrived at in a collective political fashion. So on the one hand, there have been some positive changes in that we, I think, pay far more attention to the activities of Western companies selling surveillance software and surveillance and censorship software to authoritarian states. There are attempts to regulate this trade. There are attempts to actually do something about it. And I think that this is very encouraging. At the same time, there is very little understanding of how domestic attempts to regulate the internet and to subject it to all sorts of new forms of regulation and to introduce new surveillance laws, as might be the case in Britain, to introduce new regulation against cyber attacks. There is very little awareness and connection between this domestic debate and the broader international debate about internet freedom, because it sets traps that then authoritarian governments can exploit and say that, well, if you in Britain are monitoring your own internet traffic with all of those tools, why couldn't we do it? We have the same problems with crime and terrorism as you do, so who are you to lecture us on internet freedom when you yourselves are violating it on a daily basis? There is an army of thinkers, pundits, PR firms, Silicon Valley futurists, who are not interested in making this debate more precise, who are not interested in bringing in considerations of politics or morality or ethics to these debates. They would rather keep talking about innovation and efficiency, and I'm just not sure that this is the way forward. And and they are part of this broader intellectual infrastructure with TED Talks, with their own little Kindle singles, with blogs, with tweets, with Google Plus, with and it's a system that feeds on each other and on its many different parts. So it's a very tough bubble to pierce.